Nobody noticed the detail buried in the official readout. Not the headline, not the no deal reached that ran across every wire service by Sunday morning. The detail underneath it. In 21 hours of direct talks between the United States and Iran, the first of their kind in more than a generation, neither side put a single piece of paper on the table that both could sign. Not a framework, not a provisional clause, not a joint statement of intent. They spent 21 hours talking, and they left with less than they arrived with. Now. The question every analyst is asking publicly is, can the ceasefire hold? That is the wrong question. The right question is this: who calculated that a collapsed negotiation was more useful than a deal? Because someone did. Now, and the answer to that question tells you exactly where this is going, and why the next 10 days may decide the shape of the Middle East for the rest of this decade. Here is what officially happened. On April 11th, a U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance landed in Islamabad, Pakistan. Across the table, senior Iranian officials. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar in the room as mediator. The talks were described in advance as a potential inflection point, a chance to codify a temporary ceasefire that had been in place since April 7th, and to begin discussing the conditions that had brought the U.S. and Iran to the edge of direct conflict in the first place. 3 issues were formally on the agenda: Iran's nuclear program, the terms of international sanctions, and free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Dull by the morning of April 12th, 21 hours later, Vance told reporters that Iran had not accepted the terms put forward by the U.S. side. Iranian officials, for their part, said U.S. demands had been excessive and had blocked all meaningful progress. Pakistan issued a statement urging restraint and calling on both parties to uphold the ceasefire. The ceasefire is now scheduled to expire on April 22nd, 10 days from today. Gulf stock markets opened Monday with immediate losses. Oil futures moved, and U.S. military assets in the region remained, in the careful language of official briefings, in a posture of readiness. That is the official version. But the official explanation left one thing out. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, not as a shipping lane, as a pressure valve. At its narrowest point, the strait is 21 miles wide. Yes, through it passes, depending on the quarter, between 17 and 21% of the world's oil supply. Every barrel that moves from the Persian Gulf to Europe, to India, to China, to Japan, most of it moves through those 21 miles. Iran knows this, has always known this. In 2019, when the last major Hormuz crisis erupted, Tehran didn't need to fire a single missile to move markets. The credible threat of closure was enough to spike Brent crude by nearly 15% in a week. So when Iranian officials arrived in Islamabad, they weren't just negotiating over nuclear centrifuges. They were negotiating with the leverage of a choke point that no navy in the world can fully secure and no economy in the world can fully insure against. The hostile read on this, from the U.S. side, from Gulf states, yet from analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, is that Iran came to Islamabad not to negotiate, but to stall, to run out the ceasefire clock while projecting the image of a reasonable party. Now here's what the adjacent view says. Economists and energy analysts who sit outside the immediate conflict have noted something that rarely makes the cable news loop. Iran's domestic economy is fractured in ways that make full escalation genuinely dangerous for the Iranian government itself. Inflation running above 40% for the 3rd consecutive year. The rial under sustained pressure. A population that watched the 2022 uprising get suppressed, but did not forget it. For the leadership in Tehran, there is a calculation that does not appear in the official readout. A war is survivable. A war that ends in economic collapse while managing internal unrest is not. Which means both sides arrived in Islamabad carrying the same thing. A reason not to deal, dressed in the clothes of a reason to talk. And that tells you something. Something the official statement was very careful not to say. We'll come back to what it tells you. But first, the decision that made all of this inevitable. There is a moment in every protracted negotiation when someone in the room decides the cost of a deal is higher than the cost of no deal. In Islamabad, that calculation appears to have been made on both sides, simultaneously, and in private, well before the 21 hours were up. On the U.S. side, the stated red line is unambiguous. Iran cannot be permitted to acquire nuclear weapons capability. That position has been consistent across administrations, parties, and a decade of shifting policy. What changes is the tolerance for interim arrangements, partial deals, sunset clauses, verification frameworks. The Trump administration's decision in 2018 to abandon the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement signed in 2015, did not make Iran's nuclear program smaller. It made Iran's nuclear program faster. Since 2018, according to IAEA monitoring data, Iran has expanded its uranium enrichment capacity significantly, reaching enrichment levels that place it within months, not years, of weapons-grade material. If the decision to proceed were made, that is not a claim. That is the finding of the international body tasked with knowing. So when U.S. negotiators sat down in Islamabad, they were not negotiating from a position of comfortable deterrence. And they were negotiating against a clock that had been running, in part, because of a decision made 8 years ago by the same administration that sent J.D. Vance to Pakistan this week. That is the uncomfortable admission. On the Iranian side, the calculation is equally clear and equally constrained. Sovereignty over the nuclear program is not just a technical or military issue. It is the central pillar of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy narrative. Every Iranian leader since 1979 has built domestic credibility in part on resistance to external pressure. A deal that requires Tehran to formally cap, dismantle, or submit its nuclear infrastructure to binding external verification is not just a security concession, it is a domestic political crisis. Here is the human reality that doesn't make it into the briefing documents. So the officials in that room, on both sides, are not irrational actors. They are people who understand clearly that the alternative to a deal involves ships burning in the Gulf, oil at prices that will close European factories and empty Indian grain warehouses, and a regional war that will outlast every career in that room. They understand it, and they still walked away. That gap between understanding the cost and accepting the terms is where the next 10 days will be decided. 3 scenarios, honest about their probability. Scenario 1, a back-channel deal holds the ceasefire. Pakistan and China, the two parties with the most structural interest in preventing both a war and a U.S.-dominated settlement, continue as intermediaries. A provisional agreement extends the ceasefire beyond April 22nd. No formal deal. No framework. Yet just a pause that buys time. This is possible. It is the scenario that every diplomat in the region is publicly hoping for. The fact that it requires Iran and the U.S. to agree on almost nothing, just to not shoot at each other, gives it a functional floor. But it is not stable. It is a pause with a countdown attached. Scenario 2. The ceasefire expires and neither side escalates immediately. This is, historically, the most common outcome of failed diplomatic rounds in this region. The 2019 Hormuz crisis escalated, then de-escalated, then produced no resolution. The 2003 pre-Iraq diplomatic collapse produced a war, but it took months after the formal breakdown. The space between the end of talks and the start of shooting is not always short. Both governments have domestic audiences to manage, allied partners to consult, and military advisors who are advising caution alongside the hawkish voices. This scenario, the drift, is the most likely, not because anyone wants it, but because it requires the least active decision-making. It happens by default. The risk in the drift scenario is accumulation. Each day the ceasefire holds without a deal is a day in which both sides continue to reposition. U.S. naval assets in the Gulf are not static. Iranian coastal defense systems are not static. The space for accidental escalation, a miscommunication, a patrol vessel in the wrong coordinates, a decision made at the tactical level that no one in Washington or Tehran authorized, that space narrows with every passing week. Scenario 3. Limited conflict in Hormuz. This is not full regional war. It is targeted. Yes, Iran moves to impose partial restrictions on commercial shipping. The U.S. responds with escort operations. The same posture it used during the 1987 tanker war, when the Reagan administration reflagged Kuwaiti vessels and sailed them through Iranian-controlled waters. It worked then. The conditions in 2026 are not the same. Iran's missile capabilities in 2026 are not the same as 1987, and the tolerance of China and India, both of whom depend heavily on Gulf oil, for a prolonged disruption is not the same as it was in the Cold War era. This scenario triggers a global energy shock within 72 hours of initiation, not a price increase, a supply rupture. Now, here's the second thing that was left out of the briefing. At the end of the Islamabad talks, the one party in the room who actually achieved something was Pakistan. Islamabad positioned itself on the record as the credible neutral host of the first direct U.S.-Iran negotiations in decades. That is a diplomatic asset with a long shelf life. Pakistan's foreign minister left those talks with his country's regional standing measurably improved, regardless of the outcome, which raises a question nobody in the post-collapse coverage has yet asked. If a failed negotiation was more useful to the host than a successful one, what does that tell you about the incentive structure that produced the failure? The historical parallel that fits most cleanly here is not 2019. It is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, not the resolution, but the 13 days before it. When two governments who both understood the stakes were unable to find a formula, not because no formula existed, but because neither side could accept the domestic cost of the concession required to get there. In 1962, it resolved. Kennedy and Khrushchev found a back channel, a private arrangement that allowed both leaders to claim something publicly while conceding something privately. There is no Kennedy-Khrushchev back channel visible in this situation yet. 21 hours, no deal, a ceasefire with 10 days left. Somewhere in the margin of every official statement from Islamabad, between the diplomatic language and the carefully attributed blame, is a fact that neither government wants to be the one to say out loud. The formula for an agreement probably exists, the technical parameters of a verifiable nuclear limit, a staged sanctions rollback, a Hormuz access framework. These are not unsolvable problems, as diplomats have solved harder ones in shorter rooms. The problem is not the formula. The problem is who has to move first, and what moving first costs them at home. The Gulf states are watching. China is watching. India is watching. 89 million people in Iran are watching their currency, their grocery prices, their government's next move. The markets open Monday with a verdict already priced in. They just haven't put a number on the range yet. The question that the most powerful people in the room left Islamabad without answering is not whether a deal is possible. It's whether either side has the domestic political architecture to survive making one. That question does not have an answer today. And the ceasefire expires in 10 days. What do you think happens next? Drop it in the comments.